Have you ever witnessed someone being humiliated because they don't look like they belong? If it were you sitting in first class, having just won a scholarship, and carrying the pride of your parents in your heart, how would you react when you were pulled to your feet? With the entire cabin looking coldly at you that morning at New York International Airport, Layla Collins, a 17-year-old black girl, boarded an Atlas Air flight. The first-class ticket in her hand was a gift from her father, Graham Collins, CEO of the airline. But for Diane Walker, a veteran flight attendant, it was all just a suspicious mistake, a slap. A young girl was humiliated in public, not knowing that her insulted father was sitting right behind her, silently witnessing everything. If it were you, what would you do? Resist? Or let justice speak for itself? Stay until the end, because this is not just a story about a slap, but a silent journey of dignity and awakening. If you believe that silence has power, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to join me in starting the story of this unforgettable flight. New York International Airport has a rhythm to it in the morning. No one is in a real hurry, but no one is really stopping either. The flow of people is a cold wave, where every face is looking somewhere else, and no one looks at each other long enough to notice anything. In the midst of the crowd, Layla Collins stood still, clutching her plane ticket as if she were holding something sacred. She was only 17 years old, petite, with bright black eyes, and a voice as soft as a breath. She didn't stand out among the luxurious suits and suitcases, except for one thing: her quietness. The kind of quietness that made others want to approach her, but also embarrassed to make any noise. The ticket in her hand read Atlas Air, first class, a gift from her father, Graham Collins, the head of that very airline. To the world, he was the cold CEO, the one who made billions of dollars. But to Layla, he was just Dad, the one who taught her to be calm in the face of injustice, and to never let anyone make you forget your worth, even if they can't see it. It was her first flight alone, to San Francisco, to the honors ceremony. She had studied 4 years for this moment. Proud, yeah, nervous, yes, but most of all, Layla felt grateful. She had never flown first class, had never seen the world from the perspective of those who were always served first. Oh, as she walked through first class, Layla paused. The smell of new leather, the sound of pouring wine, the gleam of shiny metal, it was all overwhelming, yet she tried to remain calm. She set her bag down on seat 1C, checked her ticket again, and smiled slightly, as if to say, I really did it. No one paid her any attention. No one needed to. They were busy with laptops, phones, and loud calls from people who believed the world needed to hear them. Layla opened her book and sat still, the light reflecting off her smooth brown skin. It wasn't until a voice rang out from behind, soft but with a controlling tone, that the atmosphere changed. Missy, can I see your ticket, please? The speaker was Diane Walker, the chief flight attendant, 40 years old, hair pulled back in a bun, a professional smile honed over thousands of flights. But there was something else in her gaze, a thin, sharp, razor-sharp light. Layla gently handed over the ticket, keeping her hands politely. Diane looked at the ticket, then back at her. A pause. Layla's eyes caught it a quick glance, almost unconscious, but enough to change the mood. First class. Huh, Diane repeated softly, almost to herself. Are you sure this is your seat, sweetheart? The question wasn't loud, but a few people nearby raised their heads. Layla nodded slightly. Yes, ma'am, seat 1C. Diane pursed her lips. Her smile thinned. She looked at the ticket one more time, then said in the patient voice of someone about to correct someone, Maybe there's a mistake. Let's have you wait back there while I double-check." "Okay." Layla was about to say something, but then stopped. In that moment, she remembered what her father said. Not every absurdity needs to be fixed with words. She just nodded slightly, picked up her bag, and stood up. The passengers watched. No one said anything, but their eyes spoke volumes. Some averted their eyes, and a few chuckled the kind of grin one gives to a poor girl who doesn't understand the rules of a high place. Layla walked down the aisle. Each step felt like a knife cutting into her dignity. She didn't cry, nor did she bow her head. There was only a heavy silence between the hum of the engine and the shuffling of the suitcase. In the economy class, she sat in an empty seat near the back and leaned out the window. Outside, the sky in New York was gray, the sky of people who don't know they're about to be tested. Up above, Diane Walker folded the ticket and put it in her pocket. She turned back to first class, completely unaware that in the seat directly behind Layla, a man was watching the whole scene, his eyes cold, but not angry. Graham Collins. He said nothing. He just stared at the empty space his daughter had left, a void that made everything inside him stop. The man knew it well. Small mistakes can create big cracks in a seemingly perfect system. And this time, it happened, right before his eyes. When Diane Walker returned to first class, she had no idea that her every word, her every look, had been heard by the only person on the plane who had the power to decide her own future. And that's when silent justice begins to work. In the chilly first-class cabin, the sound of glasses clinking and wine pouring filled the air like a breath of luxury. Diane Walker walked down the aisle, each stride honed by years of first-class service. She didn't need to look at the passengers' tickets. Just one look was enough to tell who belonged here. And so, when she saw Layla Collins, the young black girl sitting quietly in seat 1C with her arms propped up on her book, something inside her cringed. Not because Layla had done anything wrong, but because she looked out of place. Diane had seen thousands of passengers, but she still believed that there was one type of person who could not be mistaken people who knew exactly where they were supposed to be. And Layla, in her eyes, was not that type. "Miss, I told you, this seat is first class. Could it be that you read the ticket wrong?" Diane's voice was steady, but it had a high pitch that made everyone around her raise their heads slightly. Layla was silent. She held out the ticket, her small hand trembling slightly, but her eyes remained steady. Diane took the ticket, looked at it carefully, then glanced ahead, where the white passengers sat chatting busily with familiar airs. It could be a system error. You know, we get that sometimes. The sentence was half-hearted, both an apology and an order. She didn't wait for an answer. She gestured with one hand. Her voice hardened. "Please take your things and follow me to the back." Layla said nothing, not because she didn't know how to respond, but because she knew no one would listen. She stood up. She moved slowly, gently, not dropping anything, as if to prove that she still had the choice of how to walk. The man in seat 1D, Graham Collins, looked at his daughter from the corner of his eye, his face expressionless. He wanted to intervene, to say something, but then stopped. He had taught his daughter that sometimes justice requires silence so that the wrongdoer can hear his own footsteps. Layla stepped out of the pew. An older woman shifted her feet slightly, avoiding her skirt. A young man with headphones looked at her curiously, then looked back down at his phone. "No, excuse me. No, what's wrong?" Silence. A silence filled with complicity. The economy cabin echoed with the sounds of babies crying and suitcases being hastily packed, and Layla walked through the space like a lost note. Diane stopped at the last row of seats and pointed, "You can sit here until we confirm." Layla nodded. She sat down, clutching her small bag to her chest, looking out the silver-gray window. There, other planes were taking off, streaking through the clouds free and carefree, as if the world outside had no invisible boundaries. Another young flight attendant, Tara Moore, glided by, her eyes faltering as she saw Diane standing smugly beside her. Tara looked as if she wanted to say something, but then stopped. Silence in luxury is expensive, sometimes the price of job security. Layla flipped open her phone and typed a few words. "I'm fine. They said there was a mistake. I'm in the back." The message was sent. She had no idea that the recipient, her father, was less than 10 feet away. Diane returned to first class, adjusted her hair, and let out a small breath, as if she had just completed a small task. She didn't think much of it, didn't feel the need to apologize. To her, it was just check procedure. In Diane's mind, there was no racism, at least she believed so. She thought she was just defending the standards of high service. But in truth, standards are sometimes just ego-masking arrogance. In seat 1D, Graham closed his eyes. His breathing was slow and deep, but there was a headwind inside him. He knew that if he spoke up right then, the conversation would end quickly. But true justice lies not in retaliation, but in letting the wrongdoer face his own eyes. For a few minutes, he sat still, listening to the familiar sound of the engine preparing to take off. Then, very quietly, he opened his phone and looked at the message from his daughter. The light from the screen reflected on his face, warm and cold at the same time. No one on the flight knew that the man sitting silently owned the entire airline Atlas Air, and that a single tap of his phone could change the fate of anyone on the crew. But he still chose to remain silent. Silent, not because of weakness, but because he understood that sometimes the silence of those in power is the most expensive lesson for petty abusers. In the economy cabin, Layla closed her eyes and leaned her head back on the seat. She didn't cry. Only her small shoulders rose and fell with each slow breath. She had learned from a young age, people can take away your seat, but they can't take away your dignity if you don't let go. Meanwhile, Diane was still recounting the story to another colleague in a triumphant voice. "That girl, she must have gotten the wrong ticket. Someone booked it for her without understanding the seat class policy. It's a shame, but I have to follow the procedure." "Right." Tara didn't answer. She looked down at the floor, where the light from the economy cabin reflected off it, a dim but real light. A few seconds later, the intercom announced that she was preparing for takeoff. Diane adjusted her scarf and stepped into her seat, completely unaware that a pair of eyes were watching her every move, right behind her. The plane began to taxi down the runway, carrying two people, a woman who had just abused her small power, and a man who was preparing for the biggest lesson of her life. The sky opens, and silent justice waits to be called. The plane lifted off the runway with a dull thud. Everything outside the window became smaller and smaller, until there was only a mist of white clouds. No one in first class knew that right here, in the thin air at 30,000 feet, another storm was brewing. Graham Collins sat quietly in seat 1D, his eyes fixed on the empty space in front of him, where seat 1C now bore only traces of its occupant. That emptiness was more than just a seat. It was like a void inside him, cold, tight, and very clear. The phone screen vibrated slightly. A message appeared. "I'm fine. Just a little confusion. I'm in the back. Graham's hand tightened. He read the short line over and over again, as if each word were etched into his mind. Not that his daughter was complaining, but that she wasn't complaining. Layla's silence made him understand that she was trying to keep his words. Don't let anyone see you lose your temper, even when they're wrong. And that was what hurt him the most. He raised his head. Up ahead, Diane Walker was checking the passenger list, talking quietly to a young flight attendant, Tara Moore. Her voice was low, but enough for him to hear a few words fall out. First class is not a place to try your luck. They should know that. The words were soft, but carried the weight of an invisible slap. He didn't react. He just leaned over and took out his headphones, as if he were going to watch a movie. But instead of plugging them in, he pressed a small button on the back of the phone, a direct internal call to Atlas Command HQ. The female receptionist's voice came on the line. Professional and concise Atlas Command. Hello. Who's on the line? He replied, his voice low, even, and slow enough for each word to sink in Graham Collins. I'm on flight 1183, New York, San Francisco. There was a short silence. Then the female voice immediately changed to a respectful one. Yes, Mr. President. Please wait a moment. I will connect to the Flight Command Department. Diane still had no idea what was happening. She continued adjusting her uniform, arranging the drinks, and exchanging pleasantries with the passengers. Everything in her little world was normal, but in a few minutes, that world would shatter. In the cockpit, an emergency signal was transmitted to Captain Hayes, who was controlling the flight. He looked at the screen, frowning slightly. Atlas Command calling in flight. The answer from the walkie-talkie made him stunned. Yes. A direct call from Chairman Graham Collins. He's on your flight. The air in the cockpit sank. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then the two pilots looked at each other. It was as if they had just been informed that a supreme judge was sitting in the seat right behind them. In first class, Graham remained in the same position. His eyes stopped at the empty space in seat 1C, then slid across the curtain separating first class from economy, the thin curtain that divided the two worlds, a world of privilege and a world of tolerance. He recalled the first time he brought Layla to Atlas Air headquarters. She was only 12 years old at the time, asking in a clear voice, Dad, why do I only see white people in the big meeting room? He was silent. He didn't have an answer then, but he did now, and it was happening before his eyes. The phone in his hand buzzed with confirmation. The voice of Marcus Lane, the flight operations manager, appeared. Sir, we have received a call. What happened? Graham replied briefly. I would like to report inappropriate behavior by a flight attendant. She has just insulted a first-class passenger, and that person is my daughter. There was a pause. Not because the other side hadn't heard, but because they didn't believe they'd heard correctly. Marcus replied softly, Sir, Miss Layla Collins is on that flight. Yes, he said, his voice colder than the wind outside. And she's sitting in economy class right now. I want this handled immediately. According to procedure, no exceptions. No matter who. Marcus swallowed. Yes, sir. I will contact Captain Hayes immediately. Graham ended the call, put the phone down on the table, and leaned back in his chair. No anger, no complaints. Just silence. The silence of someone who knows the truth doesn't need to be shouted to be heard. In the cockpit, the intercom signal sounded. Captain Hayes looked at his colleague, his voice slowing down. HQ just confirmed. The president of Atlas Air is on this flight. He wants us to check the incident with the chief flight attendant immediately. A small red light flashed on the control panel. In first class. The crew call light came on. Diane was startled. She pressed the answer button. Yes. Cockpit clear. Hayes' voice came back, slow and sharp. Diane Walker. Right, I just got a call from headquarters. They want to verify a complaint about your behavior with passenger Layla Collins. The name Layla Collins made Diane freeze. She remembered the girl's face, the silent look in her eyes, the ticket she had held in her hand. But what sent a chill down her spine wasn't the name, but the last two words Hayes added, so clearly Graham Collins' daughter. He's on the plane. The entire first-class cabin seemed to hold its breath. Diane stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the empty space in front of her. She could feel her hands shaking. Sweat trickled down the back of her neck, and a voice in her head kept repeating, "It can't be. It can't be him." Tara Moore glanced over and saw Diane pale. She didn't understand what was happening, only that the moment that arrogant look was gone. Diane tried to take a deep breath, tried to smile, but her lips were too dry to speak. All she knew was this everything had changed. Diane didn't know it, but in a few minutes the intercom would ring again, not for a question, but for an order. And the plane, which had seemed to be flying smoothly, would become the stage for an unprecedented power shift. The sky is silent, but justice has begun to speak. The cockpit buzzer sounded softly, but it was enough to make Captain Hayes look up. He was in the middle of a routine check, his hands still on the controls. The dispatcher from Atlas Command HQ spoke. "Steady and clear." "Captain, we just received a direct order from Chairman Graham Collins. He is on your flight." The cockpit suddenly felt heavy, as if the air itself had frozen. Hayes turned slightly to the co-pilot, their eyes meeting in shock. "On this flight?" "Yes, sir. Flight 1183. Seat noir." A second of silence, then another. In the world of aviation, there are pieces of news that make a pilot's heart race and pieces that make it stop. This is the second kind. On the other end of the line, the dispatcher's voice continued. "Chairman Collins reports inappropriate behavior by flight attendant Diane Walker toward passenger Layla Collins. Layla's ticket is valid. He requests immediate verification and a report back within 10 minutes. Hayes swallowed. Diane Walker, the woman he had served with for 5 years. A tough, principled woman who prided herself on running first class like a luxury theater. And now she was at the center of a mid-air crisis. He pressed the intercom button and called the chief flight attendant. "Diane, this is Captain Hayes. Can you come up to the cockpit for a minute?" Diane's voice was soft, but slightly shaky as she answered through the loudspeaker. "Yes, Captain. I'll be right there." A few seconds later, the cockpit door opened. Diane stepped in, her gait still straight, but her eyes wavering slightly. Hayes gestured for her to sit in the passenger seat. He looked at her, then at the note that had just been transmitted from headquarters' sensitive incident. Chairman present. Maintain absolute silence around other passengers. Conduct immediate internal investigation. He placed the paper in front of Diane. "You should read this." Diane picked it up. It was only a few lines, but when her eyes landed on the name Graham Collins, her expression changed. Her hand froze. Her breath caught in her chest. He was here." Hayes nodded slowly. "Seat 1D. He witnessed the whole thing." The silence was so sudden that you could hear the sound of the wind turbines outside the plane. Diane stared at the paper, then looked up. I didn't know she was his daughter," Hayes replied, his voice calm but heavy. That's the most worrying thing. Diane, because you don't need to know who she is to treat her properly." The words fell like a sentence. Diane wanted to argue, to say she was just following procedure. But no words came out. All she could hear was her own rapid heartbeat and the distant sound of the engine, like the ticking of a clock counting down. Hayes continued, his voice low, and even I checked with headquarters. Layla Collins's ticket was completely valid. There was no system error. He paused, looking Diane straight in the eye. "Do you realize how serious this is?" Diane nodded slightly, but her eyes began to water. I didn't mean to be offensive. Hayes interrupted, not angry, just speaking very slowly. "In this business, Diane, we don't just serve customers. We represent the company, its values. And today, you embarrassed the company's founder on your flight." Those words made Diane unable to look him in the eye anymore. She bowed her head, her hands trembling on her knees. In that moment, all the power, all the authority she had held, suddenly turned into a void. Hayes called the radio, his voice returning to professional command. "This is Captain Hayes. I confirm the incident is as reported by Chairman Collins. I am taking internal action. I will report back within 5 minutes." The other side quickly replied, "Understood. Carry out instructions from above." He hung up and turned to Diane. "President Collins requires you to publicly apologize to passenger Layla Collins on this flight. After that, you will temporarily hand over cabin control to Tara Moore until landing. Do you understand?" Diane nodded slightly, tears welling up in her eyes, but she dared not wipe them away. Hayes added softly but firmly, "Do the right thing. Diane, if you want to be remembered as a correcting employee, rather than one guided by prejudice." She stood up. Her hand holding the cockpit door was shaking slightly, but her voice was low and sincere. "Thank you, Captain. I will do it right away." The door closed. Hayes sighed, looking out the window at the milky clouds. He knew that, in a few minutes, in the passenger compartment, all eyes would be on a woman suffering the consequences of the way she had looked at another, below, in the economy cabin. Layla sat still. She had no idea what was going on in the cockpit, nor that her silence had set the system into motion. In first class, a few flight attendants began to whisper. Word of mouth spread like wildfire. The boss is on the flight, himself. And the girl who was kicked out is his daughter. No one believed it completely, but everyone could feel the strange atmosphere. Eyes were more cautious. Voices were softer. Even footsteps were lighter. In the closed world of the airplane, where every square inch reflects status, the news was a thunderbolt. It reversed all measures of power for a few brief minutes. One realized that belonging here was no longer defined by skin color or seat, but by character. As Diane walked back into the passenger compartment, each step echoed dryly on the thick carpet. Each step was like a heartbeat breaking in midair, because she understood. Apologizing to others is easy, but apologizing to the truth, that is the hardest thing. And Flight 1183 still floats quietly in the clouds, where justice begins to take flight. The plane continued to fly silently through the thick clouds. The soft yellow light of the first-class cabin seemed strangely peaceful, as if no disturbance had just occurred beneath the smooth floor. But to Diane Walker, her heartbeat now echoed like footsteps in the empty corridor. She had just stepped out of the cockpit, the instructions from headquarters still in her hand. In 10 years of flying for Atlas Air, she had never once been called out in midair. But today, Not only was she called out, she had to apologize, and do it in front of all the passengers. "Captain Hayes." Voice still echoed somewhere in her head. "This is a direct order from Chairman Graham Collins. You are to apologize to passenger Layla Collins and return her to seat 1C now." Diane tried to take a deep breath, but her chest felt tight. She could feel Tara Moore's eyes on her from a distance. Tara said nothing, but in her eyes, Diane saw something she never thought possible: pity. She hated that feeling, but for the first time, she understood sometimes. Pity was a reflection of a mistake that was all too obvious. Diane walked slowly down the aisle. Her high heels clicked steadily but heavily on the carpet. Each step seemed to last forever. When the curtain between first class and economy opened, harsh white light flooded in. The economy cabin was full, cramped, noisy, and too real for the luxurious world she was used to. Layla sat in the window seat, headphones in, looking out as if at the clouds. She didn't see Diane right away. Diane, for the first time, didn't know where to start. She stood there for a few seconds, her hand clutching the paper so tightly that it crumpled. Her voice came out, low, and then trembling. Miss Layla Collins." Layla turned back, took off her headphones, her eyes calm as if she was listening to an unfinished song. "Yes." Diane swallowed. Her lip trembled, but this time not from fear, but from shame. I want to apologize for what happened earlier." The cabin was silent. The children stopped crying. The fans seemed to stop. Some passengers turned. Others held their breaths. No one expected to see the Atlas Air Chief Stewardess bowing to a 17-year-old black girl. Layla looked at Diane for a few seconds. She didn't answer right away. There was no anger in her eyes, only the weariness of someone who was used to being doubted. "I'm sorry." "For what?" Layla asked softly, her voice as light as a breath, but it carried louder than the cabin speaker. The question pushed Diane against the wall. She blinked, took a deep breath, and said, I suspected you didn't belong in this compartment. I was wrong. Your ticket was perfectly valid, and I had no reason to treat you like this." There was a beat of silence. Layla looked at her. Her lips pursed for a moment. Then a small smile appeared, not bitter, not cold, just enough to make one examine oneself. "I accept your apology." Diane bowed her head slightly, her eyes red. "Thank you." Then, as if to complete the last part of her mission, she leaned over. "Please allow me to take you back to seat 1C. Chairman, Mr. Collins wants you in your proper seat." That statement caused a stir among the passengers in the economy class. A middle-aged man blurted out, "The chairman, Mr. Collins. Is he on this flight?" No one answered, but the name alone shook the entire cabin. Layla stood up. She didn't look smug or evasive. She just nodded slightly. "Yes. Let's go." Diane walked ahead, Layla following. The passengers watched them, some bowing their heads, others looking on with a mixture of confusion and shame. The sight, a young woman calmly walking down the aisle, followed by the man who had humiliated her, was quieter but more powerful than any speech. When they returned to first class, Graham Collins was still sitting in seat 1D. He didn't look back, but when Layla put her bag down in seat 1C, he whispered, just loud enough for her to hear, "Welcome back, sweetheart." Layla smiled. Diane stood still behind, not daring to raise her head. Then Captain Hayes' voice rang out over the intercom, steady and cold. "Notification to all flight crew. Chief Flight Attendant Diane Walker has been temporarily suspended from duty. After landing, She will work with the airline's disciplinary department. All flight control will be temporarily transferred to Flight Attendant Tara Moore. The cabin fell silent again. Diane bowed her head, clasped her hands together, and stared at the carpet. Everything she had ever prided herself on, her voice, her posture, her confidence vanished in a single flight. Graham didn't look at her. He didn't need to. Justice isn't punishment. It's the moment the wrongdoer sees he's wrong, when no one needs to say anything more. Layla opened the book and turned back to the page she had been reading. The light reflected off the pages, making her skin glow under the lamplight. No one dared say anything more. But from economy class to first class, everyone understood some lessons are taught not with words, but by silently watching the truth speak. As Diane quietly left the first-class section, each step sounded like the crack of a proud shell. But unbeknownst to her, the true journey of awakening had only just begun, and it would bring her face to face with the person she once despised. The sky remained still, but inside that plane, the world of power had just shifted as the first-class doors closed. Diane Walker stood alone in the aisle. Gone was the lullaby of the engines, only the pounding of her heart in her chest, pounding like a drumbeat signaling an internal storm. She knew she wasn't truly over this because the apology, though formal, still fell short of the truth. Diane turned. The white light of the economy cabin illuminated her face, revealing every trace of tension. Her breathing was shallow. Her shoulders shook slightly, but she kept going. She had to do the right thing, even if it was late. Layla was still sitting in the same row, headphones removed, eyes staring straight ahead. There were no tears, no anger, just a calmness that was unnerving. When Diane stopped, Layla looked up. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The air was thick. Diane swallowed, trying to find the words. "Miss Layla, I want to make it clear. What just happened was truly a misunderstanding. I didn't mean to offend you. Layla interrupted, her voice so soft that it made Diane stop immediately. Misunderstanding. There was a pause, then Layla tilted her head, looking at her. So why am I the only one being checked? Diane opened her mouth, but there was no answer. Layla continued, her voice steady, not rising, not trembling. Why do you think I don't belong there? The question echoed slowly, falling like a heavy stone in the cramped space. Everyone in the compartment stopped moving. The man who was about to drink his coffee stopped mid-sentence. The child stopped kicking the seat in front of him, and the woman in the next row gently squeezed her husband's hand. Diane couldn't look Layla in the eye. She felt cold all over. Every reason that had once made sense in her head procedure, test, suspicion suddenly rang hollow and hollow. She tried to say something, but her throat felt tight. Layla still looked at her. No contempt, no anger. It was that calmness that made Diane collapse. I don't know, Diane whispered. Maybe because I thought you were young and I guessed wrong. Layla nodded slightly. You didn't guess wrong. You chose wrong, she said slowly. You chose to believe what society whispered that people like me couldn't sit in that chair. And you thought you were just doing the right job. The words were not heavy, but they were as sharp as a thin blade. Diane listened to them, feeling as if each word cut deep into the pride she had thought of as professional ethics. Layla bowed her head slightly, her voice low, as if talking to herself rather than accusing anyone. I'm not angry. I'm just sad. Because if I weren't Graham Collins's daughter today, maybe no one here would see anything wrong. The air in the economy cabin felt like it had been sucked out of oxygen. Everyone bowed their heads. An older white man in the front row let out a soft sigh. A young woman quietly removed her headphones. They didn't speak, but their silence was a collective confession. Diane stood there, still clutching the note in her pocket. She realized that the scariest thing was not being disciplined, but seeing herself through the eyes of others, petty, blind, and sure of herself. Layla looked at her for a few more seconds, then said softly, "You know, my father once taught me that there are two types of power in this world: power that comes from title, and power that comes from character. The second type, if you have it, will never be lost. The first type, with just one mistake, it disappears." Diane bit her lip. Her eyes began to water. No one said anything, but in the cold white light of the economy cabin, the sight of the woman standing before the young girl head bowed, hands shaking, made the cabin look back at itself. Layla let out a soft breath, her voice so soft it almost melted into the sound of the engine. "You don't need to explain further." Everyone's silence just now. "Said enough." Diane nodded, her eyes downcast. She turned away, her steps heavy, disappearing into the crowded seats. No one applauded, no one said a word of encouragement. But the way everyone avoided looking at her was the deepest punishment. When Diane returned to first class, Tara Moore stood there, her eyes full of sympathy. She was about to say something, but Diane raised her hand, stopping her. "Tara, you don't have to say it. I understand." Her voice was hoarse, almost breaking. "It wasn't that she embarrassed me. It was that I let her teach me a lesson I should have known long ago." Tara bowed her head slightly. There was nothing more to say. Below. Layla sat still. She looked out the window, where the sky was still a calm blue. She knew the storm had passed, at least for her, but somewhere in the hold, hearts had been torn out and were beginning to learn to beat again. Oshtuan. From the cockpit, Captain Hayes watched through the internal camera. He saw Diane return to her seat. Her shoulders slumped, her eyes red. He didn't need to know what she said, because just by the way she walked, he knew justice had reached where discipline could not. The sky outside was still, but inside the plane, awareness was born from a dialogue that needed no end. From the cockpit, Captain Hayes watched through the internal camera. He saw Diane Walker walk slowly toward the service area, her shoulders heavy, her eyes no longer the sharp look of someone who had controlled everything. He knew that some storms don't come from the sky, they come from within. The curtain closed behind her. The first-class cabin was filled with the only sound of the engine and Diane's ragged breathing. She leaned against the service cabinet, her hands resting lightly on the cold steel, her eyes staring blankly into the darkness ahead. 10 years in the business. She had thought she knew people just by looking at how they dressed, how they spoke. She could tell what class they belonged to. But today, she realized she had confused professionalism with judgment. The door to the service compartment opened softly. Tara Moore, a young flight attendant, walked in. She was almost 20 years younger than Diane, her eyes bright, her voice soft but clear. She was silent for a few seconds, then said, "Are you okay?" Diane didn't answer right away. She took a deep breath, then said softly, "I used to think I was a fair person, Tara, but it seems I'm only fair to people like me." Tara stepped closer, placing her glass of water on the table. "You know, when you said misunderstanding earlier, I thought you were trying to save your honor. But when Layla asked you again, I saw that you couldn't speak any more. Because actually, you understood. You just didn't dare admit it." Diane looked up slightly, her eyes tired. "Do you think I deserved this Tara didn't dodge? No, I think you brought it on yourself." The answer fell, quiet, but louder than the sound of the engine. Diane blinked, her lips trembling slightly. Tara continued, her voice even, not harsh, just matter of fact. "I used to admire you. Everyone does. You are the epitome of standard, but today I realized sometimes standard is just a pretty dress to cover up prejudice. You didn't mess with the process, but you messed with the person." Diane looked away. She wasn't angry. She didn't have the strength to be angry. She was just ashamed. In that moment, she remembered Layla, the girl with the unnerving calm in her eyes, asking her a simple question. "Why do you think I don't belong there?" The question echoed over and over, like a scratch in her mind. Diane said softly, almost to herself, "I just want everything in its place, everyone where they belong." Tara interrupted, "But don't you realize that you're the one who's in the wrong place?" "Diane." There was a long silence, only the faint hum of the engine outside. Diane looked down at her hands, her fingers rubbing together. Her skin was dry, tired, and trembling slightly. For the first time in her career, she felt truly small. Tara looked at her, her voice suddenly softer. "I know, you don't mean any harm, but sometimes goodwill is the most dangerous thing, because it makes us think we're right when we're doing wrong." Diane was silent. Her eyes welled up, but she did not cry. A drop fell onto the metal table, water or sweat. It was unclear. She exhaled, speaking slowly. Her voice choked, but sincere. "You know, Tara, when I saw that girl sitting in seat 1C, I didn't see a passenger. I saw something out of place, and I acted like I was protecting the brand. But now I understand. It was the brand that made me forget that we serve people, not images." Tara nodded slightly. "That's what she reminded us all of." Diane smiled slightly, a tired but genuine smile. "Strange. Sometimes one person just needs to keep silent to make the whole system shake." Tara replied softly. "It is not silence, but the strength of dignity." That sentence made Diane bow her head for a long time. She realized what weighed on her chest was not fear, but hindsight. Outside, the sky was still clear. The plane was still moving at a steady pace, but inside the cabin, Diane felt like she was in a different space entirely, a place where everything she had ever believed was being dismantled piece by piece, to make way for a simple truth. No one belongs because of the color of their skin, or because of how much money they make, or because of the chair they sit in. People belong where they behave. Tara touched her shoulder lightly, then stepped back. "You'll be fine, but only if you really learn from this." Diane nodded slightly. Her voice was tired but steady. "I won't forget. Tara, never." She stood up, straightened her uniform, and looked into the small mirror on the door of the service compartment. The person in the mirror was still her, but her eyes were different. No more pride, no more trying to prove anything. Only one thing was clear awakening, she said softly, almost loud enough for only herself to hear. "I have humiliated myself. And now, perhaps it is time for me to learn how to do it again, from the beginning." In the row above, Layla was still reading quietly. She had no idea that with her calm demeanor, she had just changed the way a person saw the world. And as the cabin was bathed in soft lighting, People began to realize justice does not need to speak. The plane continued its journey, but from that moment on, everyone on Flight 1183 was no longer the same. The plane continued to fly through the sky as if nothing had happened, but in first class, the atmosphere was different. People sat straighter. Voices were quieter. Eyes were more reserved, as if even a wrong breath could shatter the heavy silence. Layla Collins returned to her seat in 1C. She didn't look around, didn't act proud, didn't try to feign calm. She just sat down, buckled her seatbelt, and opened her book, still unfinished, to the part where she read. Courage doesn't always come from shouting. Sometimes it comes from taking a deep breath. Beside him, Graham Collins remained silent. He did not look at his daughter, nor did he need to say anything. They both understood that some battles do not need to be won, just shown what is right. Another flight attendant, Tara Moore, walked over and gently placed a glass of water on Layla's table. "Do you need anything else?" Layla raised her head and smiled gratefully. "No, I'm fine. Thank you." The simple statement made several passengers across the table look up. An elderly woman slowly put down her magazine, her eyes a mixture of curiosity and embarrassment. The man sitting in row 1B, who had glanced at Layla with an annoyed expression when she first entered the cabin, coughed slightly, then turned around, trying to strike up a conversation as a way to make amends to society. Miss Collins. You know, Diane, the stewardess. She didn't mean anything by it. She doesn't know who you are." Layla looked up, her gaze not harsh, just straight and very calm. She put down the book, looked at him for a few seconds, and asked if I wasn't someone's daughter. Would that be acceptable? "Sir?" The man blinked. His lips moved, but there was no answer. Layla tilted her head, her voice soft, almost a whisper, but loud enough for the whole compartment to hear. "It's strange. People only feel wrong when that wrong touches someone important." The air froze. Another woman cleared her throat, then looked down at her phone, even though the screen was off. A young man in the back row looked at Layla for a long time, then slowly nodded. Not in agreement, but in recognition. Graham said nothing, but his hand rested lightly on his daughter's, in a silent compliment. He was proud not because she was his daughter, but because she had chosen the right path to return the truth to the world. In the corner of the cabin, Tara Moore watched everything. She saw the darting eyes, the feigned indifference, the faces that looked like they had just been caught in a mirror and couldn't quite make up their minds. She understood this was social testing. No one was being judged, but everyone was being tested. A middle-aged man in a suit, who seemed to be a businessman, leaned slightly towards Layla, trying to ease the atmosphere. "You know, sometimes in the service industry, people are under a lot of pressure. They don't mean it." Layla turned, looking at him with calm eyes. "I believe that, sir. But pressure does not create prejudice. It only reveals what people already think." The answer was like a knife wrapped in velvet. No one said anything more. The air in the cabin fell silent again, a silence that was not uncomfortable, but full of questioning. After a while, Graham tilted his head slightly and whispered to his daughter, "Do you feel sorry?" Layla smiled, looking out the window, where the sunset was dyeing the horizon red. "No, Dad, because if people see today, they won't dare pretend to be blind tomorrow." Graham nodded slightly, his lips curving into a smile, the smile of someone who had taught his son to choose wisdom over anger. Inside the cabin, no one said anything more. But the looks given to Layla were different. No longer suspicion or pity, but respect mixed with silence. A white woman gently pulled the blanket over Layla's shoulders and whispered, "You are so brave." Layla smiled gently. "I just don't want to be silent when silence makes others think I agree." Tara Moore stood there, listening, and realized it was exactly what Graham Collins had said in his staff training session. Silence, sometimes, is a kind of complicity. She looked around. The once indifferent faces now bowed their heads. It wasn't fear, but the first time they heard their consciences in the air. A few passengers pulled out their phones, intending to record the scene, but then stopped. No one wanted the moment to become news. It didn't need to be spread. It just needed to be understood. The windows were bathed in the orange glow of dusk. Everyone sat still. Graham closed his eyes. Layla continued reading. Tara turned away, regaining her composure. No one said anything more. But in that silence, something huge had just changed beliefs about who belonged here. A soft chime sounded over the intercom. From the cockpit, Captain Hayes announced an urgent call from Atlas Air headquarters, and this time, it was Graham Collins on the line. The crew held their breath. Justice was about to have its say. Amidst the peaceful twilight, the plane continued to glide. But inside, a wave of silence had begun to spread from one girl to an entire system. The intercom chime rang softly in the cockpit, breaking the otherwise quiet atmosphere of the flight at 35,000 feet. Captain Hayes received a call from Atlas Air headquarters, the voice of the communications officer coming over the system. "We have been asked to connect directly to Mr. Graham Collins sitting in first class." Hayes paused. He understood immediately this was no longer a small internal matter. This was a lesson being written in the sky. He pressed the switch, his voice even and careful. "Connected. Mr. Collins, your line is now secure." In the aft service compartment, Diane Walker stood with her back against a metal cabinet, her hands clasped together. She heard the intercom chime, and a hunch told her it was for her. A moment later, Graham Collins' voice came through the cabin system, deep, clear, and absolutely calm. "Chief Stewardess Diane Walker." Just 4 words. But it made the entire first-class cabin look up. Those who had been trying to pretend to be busy suddenly fell silent, as if the sky had stopped to listen. Diane swallowed and pressed the answer button. "Yes, I'm listening. Mr. Collins." His voice rang out, not high, but with a power that came not from position, but from absolute emotional control. "I witnessed the whole thing. I don't need anyone to report it, nor am I calling to embarrass you in front of the passengers or crew." A pause. His voice continued slowly, as if each word weighed down with the weight of truth. "But I need you to understand. You didn't just make my daughter feel like she didn't belong. You made everyone who was silent on this flight believe that silence was enough." The cabin was dead silent. Even the sound of the engine outside seemed to have died down. Layla sat still, eyes looking straight ahead, but her hand clutching the book lightly in her lap. Diane listened, her heart pounding, her breathing ragged. "I know you've been around for a long time," Graham continued. "You understand the process. You know how to deal with customers. But today, I saw something that the process can't teach character." His voice dropped a little. "You don't have to bow to power. Diane, you just have to respect people. And you've forgotten that." Diane trembled. Every word was a mirror to herself, a reflection of the woman who thought she was doing the right thing. She wanted to apologize, But she couldn't. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew no words would be right enough. Graham paused for a few seconds, then added slowly and firmly, "I'm not angry. I'm just sad. Because you don't know that. Before she was my daughter." Layla was a little girl working part-time at the airport cafe where she served the same passengers you're serving today. She knew what it was like to be judged by her appearance, and she promised me that if someone ever looked down on her, she wouldn't respond with anger, but with wisdom. Diane put her hand to her mouth, trying to hold back a sob. She felt the silent break inside her, the kind of feeling only a person can have when forced to face themselves. Graham continued, his voice like a cold wind blowing through an open door. "You don't have to fear me, Diane, but I want you to fear the moment you think you have the right to decide another person's worth." A sob escaped her. Diane turned away, tears falling. In the cabin, Tara Moore stood in the corner, her hands clasped together. She knew Diane wasn't a bad person, but sometimes people only realize the line between right and wrong after they've crossed it. Graham ended the call with an unforgettable line. "You won't lose your job, Diane, but you'll have to start over in a place where people won't judge you. I believe that when you learn to serve with your heart instead of your rank, you'll become a true leader." There was a soft click. The call ended. No one said anything more. The first-class cabin fell silent. Not a silence of fear, but a silence of realization. Diane stood alone, her hands shaking. She felt as if she had been stripped of everything, but at the same time, given the chance she had never had before to start over as a real person. She turned back to look at Tara, her eyes red, I think. "This is the first time I understand what it means to be scrutinized," Tara replied softly, her voice soft but firm. "And it was also the first time you saw yourself, Diane." Diane nodded. A weak smile appeared on her tear-stained face. She didn't know what the future held, but she did know one thing from this moment on. She would never do her job the same way again. Layla gently closed the book and raised her head to look out the window. The sky was still clear, but in her heart, a light rain had just fallen not of sadness, but of serenity. She understood that sometimes, to change a system, all it takes is one person to dare to keep their dignity in silence. The plane continued its journey, but the flight with all the people on board left an old world and entered one where self-respect became the new norm. The captain's voice came through the loudspeaker, soft but firm. "Dear passengers, we are preparing to land at San Francisco International Airport. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain seated." Outside the window, the late afternoon light filtered through the clouds, bathing the plane in a soft golden hue. The scene was strangely peaceful, a stark contrast to the heavy silence inside the first-class cabin. Diane Walker stood at the very back, at the counter. Her face was pale, her eyes red, her uniform still neat, but without the air of authority it once had. Every time someone passed, she bowed her head, a small gesture, but one that carried a ton of guilt. Layla Collins remained seated in seat 1C, her hands clasped over her closed book. She didn't look around, nor did she turn to the rear of the cabin. She just stared straight ahead, where the light from the window reflected off her face. There was no anger in her eyes, just a quiet sadness, the sadness of someone who knows that justice sometimes hurts. The plane touched down with a slight jolt. There was a collective gasp of relief throughout the cabin, but then the engine noise died down, and silence returned. The cabin door opened. 2 airport security officers stepped out, their dark blue shirts gleaming in the cabin lights. their badges gleaming. They walked straight toward Diane. "Ms. Diane Walker." "Yes." Her voice trembled slightly. "Please come with us. This is a request from Atlas Air's compliance department. They want to clarify some of the behavior on the last flight." Every eye in the compartment turned to her immediately. Diane nodded. No protest, no explanation. She knew this would happen. She straightened her uniform, then started walking down the main aisle. It was a strange moment. Everyone was silent, as if frozen. Only the steady sound of Diane's high heels echoed in everyone's minds. As she passed row 1C, her eyes met Layla's. They looked at each other, no anger, no apology, just acknowledgement. And then, in a perfect twist of fate, Layla was still sitting there, and Diane had to walk past her, just like the moment Layla was forced to step down to economy class, just because she was the black girl in first class. But this time, no one was indifferent. A middle-aged woman put her hand to her chest and bowed her head slightly. A male passenger, the one who had defended Diane, looked down, not daring to look up. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood this was more than a professional interrogation. This was a moral judgment being carried out in public. Layla looked on, her eyes not proud. She did not gloat. Simply the eyes of someone who had learned that forgiveness does not mean forgetting, but giving others a chance to look at themselves. Diane walked slowly, very slowly. She could hear her own footsteps echoing on the red carpet. She remembered Layla walking with her head bowed and her eyes indifferent, and now she was in that position. Part of her wanted to turn back, to apologize, but she knew this was not the time to talk. This was the time to learn. When she reached the compartment door, she stopped and turned around once. Her eyes met Layla's again. Layla smiled a small smile, but so real it made Diane's heart clench. She bowed her head, for the first time in her life. Truly. Then she walked out. The walk of shame, they called it. But for Diane, it was the first step toward her truth. Inside, Graham Collins sat still. He didn't gesture, didn't look. He just said softly to his daughter, "You see, Layla, sometimes justice doesn't need our hands. It finds its own way." "I know, Father," Layla replied softly, "but I hope she will understand. No one is truly free if they believe they are superior to others." Graham nodded, his eyes on the open door where Diane had just left. The afternoon light slanted into the cabin, illuminating the two of them, a quiet, powerful image, like the closing of a chapter. The San Francisco airport was packed. In a glass room behind customs, an interrogation was taking place. No noise, no tension, just very short questions and very long silences. And there, Diane Walker faced not just the investigators, but herself. Atlas Air's interrogation room is located on the 12th floor of its headquarters in San Francisco. It is a square room with transparent glass walls, nothing but a wooden table, two chairs facing each other, and dim white light, so evenly distributed that it is impossible to hide the expression on anyone's face. Diane Walker sat there, her hands clasped together, her eyes wearily staring at the floor. Her uniform was still pressed, but her usual confidence was gone. In front of her were two men, Samuel Ross, the compliance manager, and Marcus Lane, the firm's operations director. The air in the room was as heavy as the sky before a storm. Samuel began in a low, clear, but not harsh voice. "Miss Walker, first of all, thank you for your cooperation. We just want to hear from you again what happened on Flight 1183. Diane raised her head, her eyes dark but determined. "I suspected a passenger was in the wrong seat. She was too young, and I didn't think she could have a first-class ticket. I asked to check, and when she didn't respond, her voice choked, behaved disrespectfully. Samuel didn't take any notes. He just listened, his hands on the table, his eyes deep and cold, as if looking past her to see something behind. Don't you think that's discrimination? Diane sighed, nodding slightly. I didn't think so then. But now, I know. I saw her face as she got up from her chair. Not fear, but disappointment. And I know no one should feel like they don't belong, just because of the color of their skin. The room fell silent. Marcus Lane, sitting next to him, flipped through the files. Inside were the report, the cockpit voice recording, and an internal email from Graham Collins. Marcus gently put the file down and said, President Collins asked us to take a serious but fair look. He is not asking to fire you. Diane, he wants you to understand the reasons. Diane looked up, her eyes filled with surprise and emotion. He didn't fire me. No, but you're suspended without pay for 72 hours, pending a formal hearing. 3 days, it sounds short. But for Diane, it was a long silence, like an inner sentence. She knew it wouldn't be easy to return to her old job. But perhaps what hurt more than anything was sitting here, facing two colleagues who were looking at her not with judgment, but with disappointment. Samuel leaned forward, his voice deep and warm. Miss Walker, I've been in this business for 28 years. I've seen a lot of mistakes, a lot of excuses. But what makes me saddest is not the mistakes, but when people think they're just following the process. You know, a process is never enough without the people inside it. Diane looked at him, her lips pressed together. For a moment, tears welled up, not loudly, just falling, silently and truly. I'm not a bad person, she said softly. I'm just so used to judging things by their appearance. I thought I was doing the right thing. But when I look at Layla, I feel I don't recognize myself anymore. Marcus nodded, admitting that you're halfway there. The rest is living up to the second this company is giving you. He stood up, looked at Samuel, and said, I will announce the suspension. After that, you have 72 hours to submit your personal report. Chairman Collins will read it. Diane nodded. When the two men left, she remained seated. The only sound in the room was the hum of the air conditioner and the white light reflecting off the glass, where she saw her own face no longer the authoritative head stewardess, but someone relearning the first lesson of service respect. She took out her phone and opened her inbox. The message from Graham Collins was there. Brief. I don't want you to fear the punishment. I want you to fear the moment you stop seeing the humanity in every passenger. Diane read it again and again, tears falling again. But this time not from shame, but from relief. She felt as if she had been unlocked, not by forgiveness, but by a chance to become a better person. She wrote in her notebook, I was not careless. I chose the wrong action, and now I choose to make it right. Outside the window, San Francisco was fading into dusk. Planes were taking off, streaking across the sky like little white dots. Diane watched, taking a slow breath. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of being seen. 3 days later, an email from Atlas Air arrived in her inbox. The subject line read, Last chance to apologize. But hidden beneath the cold words was an open door, not just for Diane, but for everyone who has ever been lost between right and wrong. 3 days after the inquest, a foggy San Francisco morning. The sunlight had barely touched the glass buildings, and the sky was still damp with the dampness of the night before. Diane Walker sat at her laptop in her small rented apartment, staring at her inbox. A subject line appeared, cold and terse. Last chance to apologize. Gee, Collins. She opened the letter. It contained only 2 lines. I believe that everyone can learn from their mistakes, but only if they have the courage to admit it. No threat, no warning, just a reminder as light as a breath. But it made her heart heavy. Diane took a deep breath. Before her was a blank sheet of paper. Her hand shook slightly, but for the first time in years, she didn't try to hide it. This, she knew, wasn't a letter of apology for her work. It was a confession to the person she'd hurt and to her own conscience. She began to write. Dear Layla Collins, I thought long before picking up the pen, not because I was afraid of losing my job, but because I was afraid of making excuses again, and I didn't want to do that again. That day, when I asked her to leave her seat, I believed I was just doing my job. But the truth is, I let my prejudices drive me. I saw her not as a passenger, but as someone who didn't belong. I was wrong. Not wrong because she was Graham Collins' daughter, but wrong because she was a human being, and I had forgotten that. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I just want you to know that I'm learning to see people with new eyes. Best regards, Diane Walker. She read it over several times, then pressed send. The click was tiny, but to her, it was the sound of one door closing and another opening. 2 days later, Layla received the email while she was in the school library. She was reading a document about human dignity in modern society, an ironic topic, but one she was living with. Layla Collins was silent for a long time when she saw the sender's name. She opened the letter, reading each line slowly. There was no anger, no satisfaction, just a strange feeling, as if someone had just lit a candle in a long, dark room. Layla sat quietly, then turned on her computer and wrote a letter. Her tone was still light, but had a maturity beyond her 17 years. Dear Diane, I read your letter. Thank you for your honesty. I won't say I wasn't hurt because I felt so small when the whole cabin was staring at me. But what hurt me the most wasn't her actions. It was that I wasn't surprised. You know, that's scarier than a slap, because it shows that people like me are too used to being doubted. But today, I choose to forgive, not because you deserve it, but because I believe people can learn. I hope, when you meet someone like me again, you'll see them not through the eyes of a flight attendant, but through the eyes of a human being. I wish you peace. Layla Collins. Layla sent the letter, then sat still, looking out the window. The midday sun filtered through the trees, a warm yellow. She smiled, not because she had won, but because they were both free at last. That afternoon, Graham Collins received copies of 2 letters in the internal mailbox. He read them slowly, not missing a single line. Then he leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the glass of Atlas Air headquarters. The sky was streaked with long white streaks of planes taking off. He smiled slightly, the smile of someone who knows that true justice comes not from punishment, but from the ability of people to recognize their mistakes and choose to change. That night, Diane couldn't sleep. She read Layla's letter over and over again. At the part, I forgive you not because you deserve it, but because I believe people can learn. She paused for a long time. The words echoed in her head like a slow, sad, but beautiful song. She turned on the computer and opened the company's training materials. Under customer interaction, she wrote in red pen, There is no substitute for compassion. For the first time, she wasn't writing to report. She was writing to remind herself. Oh, Ine. The next morning, Diane walked into the Atlas Air office. No one looked at her the same way. Some nodded. Some were silent, not dismissive, but distant. She understood that trust had to be rebuilt, not with words, but with actions. She walked into the office and saw a small piece of paper on the table with no sender's name. Welcome back. Everyone falls. It's how you get back up that counts. Diane took the paper and smiled. She didn't know who wrote it, but in her heart, she heard a very familiar sound, the sound of peace. A week later, at Atlas Air headquarters, there was a board meeting. On the big screen, Graham Collins presented a plan to overhaul the company culture, where every employee would be trained on implicit bias. And in the audience, Diane sat quietly, listening, her eyes shining with a new belief that change begins not at the pinnacle of power, but with the humility of each person. A week later, the 20th floor of Atlas Air headquarters was busier than usual. In a glass auditorium overlooking San Francisco Bay, Graham Collins stood at a podium. Behind him, a large sign that read "Culture First, People First, Process Later." The atmosphere was formal, but not stiff. Directors, department heads, veteran flight attendants, and new hires were all present. In the third row, Diane Walker sat quietly, her notebook clutched lightly in her hand. She hadn't expected to be here, after all. But Graham had asked her to attend, as part of the change he was about to announce. Graham's voice rang out, deep and clear, without the need for a microphone, making the room fall silent. 3 weeks ago, a small incident on Flight 1183 made us look back at ourselves. It was not just an individual mistake. It was a reminder that, if the system is silent in the face of prejudice, fairness becomes just a slogan. He paused, his eyes scanning the room. No one moved. Then he continued, slowly, each word as sure as if it were carved into the wall. From today, Atlas Air will change, not just in words. On the big screen behind him appeared the headline, Cultural Reform Program, Human Dignity Initiative. He introduced each section, not like a CEO giving policy, but like a father teaching his child how to behave. First, anti-bias training. All employee, from pilots to ground staff, must attend unconscious bias awareness training, in person, not video, not just listening, but talking. Graham said, "None of us are born without prejudice, but we can learn not to let it control us." The screen showed footage of test training sessions pilots discussing, flight attendants sharing, some in tears. One last photo paused. Diane standing next to Tara Moore, smiling slightly. The room was quiet. Second, unfair behavior. Reporting app. Atlas Air developed an internal app that allows passengers or employees to immediately report inappropriate behavior on board, from discrimination to disrespect. The data is sent directly to the compliance center, without going through an intermediary. We can't control every action, but we can control how we react to it, Graham said, his voice even and firm. Third record, all passenger seat changes. From now on, all seat changes, whether by passengers or crew, must have a reason clearly recorded in the system. No, I think she's in the wrong seat. No, that doesn't look like first class. Graham paused, looking down the row of seats where Diane sat. His gaze wasn't heavy, just one of recognition. We will not let anyone be put down just because someone else doesn't believe they belong where they are sitting. Diane bowed her head, feeling her chest tighten, not from shame, but from the knowledge that her name would forever be associated with a great change, even if it began with a mistake. Fourth, evaluating ethics as a promotion criterion. From now on, promotions will not only be based on flight hours or revenue performance, but also on the evaluation of human service behavior. Atlas Air will value attitude as much as skills. A slide shows the company's new tagline, "Appearance is never policy." The whole auditorium erupted in long applause, not loud, but warm. Many bowed their heads and nodded, perhaps because they had also witnessed it, had been silent, and now felt their hearts lighten. After the meeting, Graham walked down, surrounded by people congratulating him, shaking hands, and sharing. But he didn't stop there. He went straight to Diane. She stood up, a little embarrassed, but Graham just smiled. "Thank you, Diane." She was surprised. "Thank me. If it weren't for that mistake, we might still think we're doing well. She helped us see what needed to be fixed, and that's worth noting." Diane said nothing. Her eyes stung. In that moment, she understood that forgiveness comes not only from the one who was hurt, but also from the one who is tolerant enough to turn the mistake into a collective lesson. That afternoon, when the auditorium was empty, Diane lingered, watching the words "Culture First" reflected on the glass wall. Outside, the sky was blue. A plane bearing the Atlas Air logo flew by, leaving a long white trail of smoke. She thought about Layla. She thought about how a 17-year-old girl had changed an entire airline giant with just a calm response and a short letter. Diane smiled and whispered, "Thank you, Layla, for teaching me how to fly properly." Layla sat on the porch with her father that evening. She held in her hand an article about Atlas Air's reform program that was being shared all over the forums. She asked him, "Do you think people can really change?" Graham looked at his daughter and replied, "No one changes just because they're told they're wrong. They only change when their hearts listen." And Layla smiled, because she knew her father had just been talking about the world, and about them. Fall weather in California can be a slowdown. Fall leaves are falling all over the campus of Pacific Ridge University, where Layla Collins, now a freshman, is preparing to speak at the Diversity and Dignity in the Modern World Conference. The talk is held in a large auditorium, with more than 300 students, faculty, and a few reporters in attendance. At the back of the room, a row of seats is reserved for representatives of Atlas Air, including Diane Walker and Tara Moore, no longer in uniform. Just people listening. Layla stepped onto the stage. She had no printed speech, just a small piece of paper, folded in half, handwritten. Her voice was low, trembling slightly at the top, but steady. I used to think the most painful thing was being insulted, but I was wrong. The most painful thing was that I wasn't surprised. The whole hall was silent. The sentence was not loud, but it reached the deepest part of each listener. Layla paused, looking around, her eyes gentle as if speaking to each person individually. When a child grows up in a society where he is used to suspicious looks, to people passing him by in silence, then when he is insulted, he is no longer surprised. He only feels familiar. And that, my friends, is the most dangerous thing. A student in the front row nodded, her eyes welling up. Layla continued, her voice warmer. "We talk a lot about discrimination as if it only happens in public. where there are cameras. But in reality, it exists in the little things, the moments when people choose to stay silent instead of speaking up. I don't blame anyone who watched and didn't intervene that day. I just hope that the next time they see something like this, they will stand up, even if it's just by saying something. Down in the audience, Diane sat motionless. Each word Layla spoke felt like a thin thread, but it was tight in her heart, not with shame anymore, but with gratitude. She saw the image of the 17-year-old girl again, silent, calm, leaving her first-class seat to a sigh of indifference from the cabin. And now, that girl was standing here, using that same calm voice to give power to kindness. Layla recounted the story of that day, without emphasizing who was wrong, without naming anyone. She simply described the feeling of a young person when she realized that the world still looked at the skin color before looking at the heart. Then she continued, her voice full of thought. When my father, Mr. Graham Collins, said that no one changes just because they are found guilty. They only change when their hearts listen. I understood that forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness is the way we stop anger from turning us into the person we hate. There was a long, deep applause. Layla smiled, then lowered her voice. If I could say anything to the older generation, to those who hold power, who keep the rules, it would be this: never be silent when you see injustice. The silence of those in power is what makes injustice last the longest. The room was silent, as if it was breathing with her. No one dared to pick up their phones. No one dared to be distracted. The afternoon light shone through the glass windows, bathing Layla's face in a warm yellow. She paused for a moment, then read the last sentence on the folded paper. I don't want anyone else to get used to the pain that I was once not surprised by. The whole room stood up. The applause was as long as the ocean. Diane Walker wiped away tears. Tara Moore turned and took her hand. Diane said softly, almost in a whisper, "That's what we're learning, isn't it?" Tara nodded, and luckily, we have time to learn. How? After the conference, Layla walked out into the hallway. Diane was waiting, holding a small bouquet of flowers, just 3 white daisies. When they saw each other, neither of them said anything for a few seconds. Then Diane approached and said softly, "Thank you for today." Layla smiled, took the flowers, and replied softly, "Thank you for coming." No hugs, no new apologies, just silence between two people who were once on opposite sides, now standing together in the same frame. Equal, simple. From afar, a student approached Layla and asked, "Aren't you angry when you tell that story?" Layla turned around, her eyes softening. "I was angry, but if I just stopped at anger, I would just be an old story. I want to turn it into a lesson that others can tell, not with tears, but with change." That night, Graham Collins watched his daughter's speech live on the school channel. He sat in his office, the lights dimmed, and only Layla's voice echoed from the screen. The most painful thing wasn't the insult. It was that I wasn't surprised. Graham turned off the video, leaned back in his chair, and smiled slightly. The smile of a father who understood that his child had become what he had always hoped: someone who could use her intelligence to heal the world, not just react to it. A few months later, Layla's speech was all over social media and was included in the internal training programs of many airlines. And elsewhere, a young flight attendant was preparing to enter Atlas Air's first training course, a course called Dignity First. In the syllabus, it read, "The story of Layla Collins. The lesson never gets old." Winter came early that year. The wind blew hard across the San Francisco airport. carrying with it the chill of the ocean. On the fourth floor of the Atlas Air Training Center, in a small room with a dim yellow light, Diane Walker sat alone. In front of her was a thick notebook, crammed with lines of writing, not flight procedures, but notes about people. She had just completed a special training course, the Dignity First program, designed after the incident last year. For 12 weeks, she was no longer a veteran flight attendant, but a student like any other, sitting and listening, taking notes, asking questions, and sometimes falling silent for long periods when a lesson touched on something she had done wrong. On the first day of the course, a trainer asked, "Tell me about a time when you looked at someone and realized you were wrong about them." The question seemed simple enough, but Diane couldn't answer. She remained silent until someone else told her about an elderly passenger who was treated rudely because she looked poor. It stung her because she had done the same thing, only to a young girl, and in front of a whole cabin full of people. Gradually, Diane began to write, not to justify, but to understand. She recorded every situation, every look, every little tantrum that she had once thought was professional. On the last page of the notebook, she wrote, "We don't have to lose our humanity to maintain discipline. Every passenger who boards the plane has a story, and I don't have the right to rewrite it." 3 months later, Diane sent her final report to the board of directors. No fluff, no flowery apologies, just a short, honest piece that made anyone who read it pause for a few seconds. "I used to think my job was to keep order in the sky. Now I understand. My real duty is to keep the dignity of everyone under those skies. I've learned that silence isn't always calm. Sometimes it's complicity, and I choose not to be silent anymore. Even though it makes me uncomfortable, I do not ask to forget my mistakes, only to be given the opportunity to prove that I can serve differently." When Graham Collins received the report, he said nothing to anyone for several days. He simply read it over and over again. At the end of the week, he signed a temporary reinstatement form with the note probation 6 months, observed under Dignity First. The day Diane returned to the first flight, it was a short trip from San Francisco to Seattle. There was no fanfare, no applause, only Tara Moore, now a flight attendant, stood waiting at the door, smiling slightly. Ready Diane chuckled. "For the first time in years, I'm truly a newcomer." She entered the cabin, slowly checking each row. Everything looked exactly the same, but the feeling was completely different. There were no more judgmental looks, no more obsession with having to control everything. Instead, there was a strange peace, as if she had just shed a shirt that had been too tight for her for years. As passengers boarded the plane, Diane paid more attention to the little details. An elderly woman's hands trembled as she searched for her ticket, and she gently helped her. A brown-skinned boy pulled a heavy suitcase, and she gently supported him and asked his name. A young woman with a tired face, and she offered her a drink before he could ask. No one was filming, no one was praising, but each of those small actions was like a thin thread, mending the trust that she had once torn. When the plane landed and the passengers left, Diane stood by the door and greeted each person. A boy turned around and said, "Miss, you made my flight so much fun." The simple words made her choke up. She bent down and softly replied, "Thank you. You made me feel like I was doing the right thing." That evening, in her hotel room, Diane opened her old notebook and wrote another line. The first day back, no need for anyone to forgive, just need to no longer be the same person. 3 months passed quickly. The board received dozens of positive comments from passengers about a stewardess Walker with a warm smile and sincere service. No one knew the story behind that name. Only Graham, when he read the report, smiled slightly. He sent no letter, no reward, just marked a small line in the file. Trust rebuilt. Quietly. Late in the afternoon, as the last flight of the day ended, Diane stood watching the sunset through the airport window. The plane took off, reflecting a bright orange glow on her face. She thought of Layla, the young girl who had taught her that sometimes forgiveness is not a gift, but a chance to live differently. Diane said softly in her heart, "I don't know where you are, Layla, but if you see me today, I hope you know that your lesson was not in vain." The wind blew through my hair, as light as a silent thank you. A year later, on the same flight, Diane encountered another special passenger, a young black girl in a large hoodie, clutching a small backpack, looking just as nervous as Layla had. And this time, she smiled and walked over, saying softly, "Are you sitting here? Let me help you." The story ended not with an apology, but with a closed circle of kindness, where the past is healed by the actions of the present. Months after her first flight back, Diane Walker sat in a small cafe near the San Francisco airport. The afternoon sun streamed through the glass, illuminating the handwritten note she was writing, not an email, not a report, but a letter to Layla Collins, the girl whose brief encounter had changed the trajectory of her life. She wrote in a shaky but firm handwriting, "Layla, I want to tell you about a special day. Today, on Flight 1183, there was a little black girl about 9 years old. She was wearing a baggy gray hoodie, and she was carrying a backpack almost as big as her. When she got on, I saw the passenger behind her frown, just like I did to her. But this time, I went first. I asked, 'Where should I sit?' She looked up, smiled, and whispered, 7C. As I helped her put her backpack on the shelf, I noticed my hands weren't shaking as much as before, maybe because this time I was doing the right thing. And in her smile, I saw her again, not with a hurt face, but with peaceful eyes. I think maybe true forgiveness is not about erasing mistakes, but about giving someone a chance to live differently. And today, I live differently. Thank you for teaching me that." Diane put down her pen, folded the letter, and put it in a white envelope. She didn't know if Layla still had the old address, but she sent it anyway. She smiled, because sometimes it's not the letter that matters, it's the courage to write it. A few weeks later, somewhere else, on a flight from Seattle to Atlanta, 2 passengers boarded the economy class. No one recognized them. They were Graham Collins and his daughter Layla. Layla was older, with the air of a college student. Graham was still simple, with the air of a man who had learned to keep his mouth shut and speak up when necessary. He chose economy class, despite the airline staff's suggestion of upgrading to business class. He smiled and said, "No need. I just want to see the world from its truest point of view." As they entered the cabin, a small sight made them both stop. A black boy of about 12 was struggling with an oversized suitcase. He looked around, confused. Before Layla could step forward to help, a flight attendant approached a woman with short hair and gentle eyes. It was Diane Walker. She gently placed her hand on the suitcase and said with a gentle smile, "Let me help you. Be careful, or this might fall on someone." The boy chuckled. The flight attendant continued, her voice as light as the wind. "Do you want to sit near the window or the aisle?" "If you want to watch the clouds, I can change seats for you." The boy looked up and nodded repeatedly. "The window. I like to look at the sky." Layla stood there, watching the scene. No one around her knew that she was witnessing a part of her own memory, but it no longer hurt, but felt strangely warm. Graham stopped too, watching in silence. He said nothing, just placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder. Layla turned, her eyes sparkling, a small smile on her lips. "Dad, sometimes I think, if just one person changes their perspective, the whole world can calm down a little." Graham nodded, his voice warm. "A small change, but it can create big waves, my child." As the plane took off, Layla looked out the window. White clouds drifted by. The sunset tinged the sky red. In that moment, she thought about what she and her father had been through, about the letters, the lessons, the necessary silences, and the moments when they stood up. At the back of the cabin, Diane stood watching the passengers settle on, her heart weightless. She didn't know that the two people sitting in a row 16, the man and the girl, were Graham and Layla Collins. But perhaps, if she had known, it wouldn't have changed anything, because she wasn't doing the right thing for recognition, but because it was right. As the plane landed, Layla got off first. She turned to take a quick look, seeing Diane helping an elderly man with his cane. She smiled slightly, as if it were a silent greeting. Diane looked up, and for a split second, their eyes met. No words, no heavy memories, just two people who had gone their separate ways, now meeting in a quiet point of understanding. That evening, when Graham got home, he read on the company's internal news site a short article with the headline, "A small change can make a big difference." The post recounted the story of a flight attendant helping a black boy on a flight, not knowing who the passenger was, simply because she wanted to serve him with respect. Under the post, hundreds of comments from employees shared their feelings, saying they felt warm, that Atlas Air's new culture was no longer a slogan, but a real breath on every flight. Graham read quietly, then turned off the screen. He looked out the window, where the airport lights flickered like falling stars. Perhaps, he thought, change never begins with a policy, but with a listening heart. The Atlas airplane took off into the night sky, its small lights flashing, reflecting off the dark clouds. Inside the cabin, Diane walked down the aisle, smiling peacefully. In the row next to the window, the boy looked out and pointed, "Look, Miss."